Shabbat Shalom. This week we're in Parashat Toledot, and this is yet another opportunity to study and learn from the scriptures. I hope that you're enjoying having this opportunity. I'm certainly pleased that we can bring it to you, and it's not the same as being together, but it's certainly better than many alternatives. So welcome this morning. We're going to be speaking about Yaakov and Yitzchak, and we've moved beyond Avraham, and Toledot can be actually translated as generations or descendants. This parsha begins with something of a mystery. Why do we call this Parashat Toledot? A few weeks ago, we had Parashat Noach. And of course, that was about the generations of Noach. So why not call this Parashat Yitzchak, as we're discussing Yitzchak's descendants? What did the sages say? The sages have questions for every issue. They may not have answers, but they always have questions. This parasha begins with another case of challenged fertility. And we look at that and we think, isn't this curious? 3 out of 4 of our matriarchs had trouble conceiving. And isn't it interesting that the conception of Yitzchak, which is absolutely miraculous because it's in Sarah's old age, and this is accepted by observant Jews, while the conception of a virgin, Miriam, mother of Yeshua, is rejected as absurd. Here we learn that Rivka is now having trouble conceiving. Although she was quite a young woman when she married Yitzchak, a common age at that time was about 14. Yes, it's too young by our standards, but that's the way things were then. We know that her barrenness was not really counted until they'd been married for at least 10 years. That was typical because, I suppose, especially because of the fact that the women were so young when they married. It's likely they had at this point been married for probably at least 20 years. So she would have been about 34 and Yitzchak would have been about 60. And she had not conceived during that time. Of course, today we would ask the question that was never asked then. Was it the husband or the wife who was infertile, or both, or neither? Both Rivka and Yitzchak prayed. They prayed that Rivka would conceive, and especially because this conception was clearly just as important as Sarah's had been. We're told that God specifically heard Yitzchak's fervent prayer, in keeping with his promises to Avraham and to Yitzchak himself. Rivka conceived twins, but her pregnancy was difficult, and apparently it was extremely painful. Hashem heard Rivka also. When she asked God why her pregnancy was so difficult, he revealed to her something quite prophetic. He said that the internal suffering that she was experiencing was a microcosmic prelude to the wider conflict that would rage between the two nations that would come from her womb. That actually tells us quite a lot. She's going to have twins, and they're going to fight one another. But also, they're going to be the fathers of different nations. So the family, in effect, is going to be split. Well, Esau was born first, and then Yaakov, and as is not particularly unusual, there was some physical connection there. Yaakov was holding on to Esau's heel, so he would have been born pretty immediately after Esau. As they grew up, we see two different characters emerging. Esau becomes a hunter, a man of the physical world, what some people would call a man's man. Yaakov instead learned wisdom from his father and his grandfather. He became a man of God, a man of the Spirit, who remained at home, taking responsibility for what was going on with their family. In a way, we could be reminded of Cain and Abel, two brothers who also had very different views of the world and very different relationships with God. Tradition has it that on the day of their grandfather Abraham's funeral, Yaakov was cooking lentils. Apparently, he was a chef. The traditional mourner's meal is this soup or stew of lentils. Esau rushed in because he was ravenous from a hard day of hunting. We don't know if he was successful, but he came in his hunger and the desire that it should be immediately satisfied. He impatiently traded his birthright and its concomitant spiritual responsibilities and rights for a bowl of lentils. By this act, he demonstrated his unworthiness to stand in the position of the firstborn. It must be noted, however, that God's choice had already been made, and his choices are seldom according to expectation. We've seen that over and over again through scriptures. When Yitzhak sensed the end of his life approaching, he summoned his elder son, as was the practice, to place upon him the birthright blessings, obviously either having heard nothing of the purchase that had taken place or of God's statement to his wife. Rivka, of course, acting, she believed, on a prophetic command from God that the blessings must go to the younger son Yaakov, arranged for Yaakov to impersonate his brother in order to receive the blessings. Following the deception, Esau revealed to his father that Yaakov had actually purchased the birthright from him, although his anger suggests that he had dishonestly expected to receive the birthright blessing in spite of his earlier disposal of this same blessing. Yitzhak then understood that the birthright had been bestowed correctly on Yaakov, and he confirmed the blessings given to his younger son as the blessings of the elder. But Esau vowed to kill Yaakov for the theft, pardon me, the theft of his birthright. Before this could happen, another Avel and the Cayenne in the making, Yaakov was sent away. He was sent to Haran, to Rivka's brother Lavan, for safety, and also with the hope that he would find a suitable wife. In other words, a wife of their lineage, a wife of the family that he came from, who were God-fearers. Esau, at the age of 40, turned away fully from his family by marrying Judith, the daughter of Beri the Hittite, and Basmath, the daughter of Elon the Hittite. Obviously, they were both pagans, and he made a definite statement about where his interests would lie in the future. We read in Romans 12:9 and 10, "Don't let love be a mere outward show. Recoil from what is evil and cling to what is good. Love one another devotedly and with brotherly love, and set examples for one another in showing respect." What would Rav Shaul say about the relationship between Esau and Yaakov? Cling to what is good and recoil from what is evil. Their lack of genuine esteem for one another led Esau's hatred of Yaakov and Yaakov's attempt to take from Esau what God had already promised would be his. This conflict only ended when the nation of Edom, the descendants of Esau, ceased to exist around the time of the Maccabees. Yaakov's life, after a propitious beginning, now seemed doomed to disaster. He'd been sent away from the very family that he had supported and encouraged and worked with. What would become of him? His twin brother wanted to kill him, saying that what he had stolen was ridiculously important to him, despite the fact that he'd already sold it. Something that Esau at the time didn't appear to want. Their parents, with Haran in mind, encouraged him to run away from home. Well, that doesn't happen very often. He did not know his relatives. He'd never been on visits to Haran, and he had never been apart from his immediate family. He was completely on his own. And he, in a sense, had become a wanderer. He was leaving everything he knew and going somewhere he didn't really know. But he'd been entreated by his parents to leave home because his brother hated him so much that he wanted to kill him. And he certainly had the ability to do so, being the great hunter of the family. Yaakov was deprived of the comforts of home, everything that he had known all his life, and all that he'd taken for granted, in a sense, as his right. He was without friends, provisions, or family support. He had much less than his grandfather Avraham had when he chose to follow God and leave everything he knew behind. Less than his mother Rivka when she had left Haran. Yaakov walked for one full day away from his home, and he was alone. He'd never really been alone. He'd never been so confused about his future and his expectations. He had no clear goals or direction, no idea of what the future would bring, when only days earlier his future had seemed assured. He had no knowledge of the place to which he was being sent by his parents or of what his relatives would expect of him. And if he had known, he possibly wouldn't have gone. He was uncertain of his welcome, and he could only wonder about his prospects and his future. Would he ever be able to go home? Perhaps at some time in your life you've felt like this, although it's unlikely you've ever been quite as abandoned or hated or alone as Yaakov. But perhaps you've experienced the same sort of sense of desolation or despair at some point in your life, perhaps when you've lost someone dear to you through death, separation, or even through disagreement. Maybe you're experiencing this sort of feeling right now as you think about the future, about your expectations, your prospects. If you've never felt like this, it's quite possible that you may have this experience in the not too distant future. What we know about life is that these experiences are common to all of us, even as a result of very different circumstances. But never give yourself up to despair. Instead, consider God's dramatic intercession in the life of Yaakov. We might say that Yaakov was outward bound. There's a charity by that name, and it has as its aim helping young people defy limitations through learning and adventures in the wild, challenging them to never give up, to change their perspective, and to learn by developing the attitudes, skills, and behaviors needed to make positive changes in their lives. Yaakov was leaving everyone and everything he'd known. He left Beersheba, and with Beersheba he left the comforts of home, his servants, everything that had been provided for him that was just there all his life. And he left behind everyone who he had known and loved, and who had loved him, his parents, friends, companions, everything to which he was accustomed. He left the past, and he journeyed towards the unknown future. That's something we all do every single day. Like all human beings, he found the unknown mystifying, perhaps even frightening. He traveled towards Haran, towards the unknown and the as yet unknowable. He went seeking relatives he knew nothing about except what his mother might remember from a time more than 40 years earlier when she was little more than a child. He was sent to find a wife from among the daughters of Lavan, his mother's brother, not knowing if Lavan was still living, or if he even had unmarried daughters, or what they would be like if they existed. He went because of his parents' strong trust and faith in God. At this point, we see no special faith evidenced by Yaakov himself. But his hope was that the same God who gave Yitzchak to Abraham and Sarah, the same God who miraculously provided his mother for his father, and vice versa, would meet his needs now and in the same miraculous way. But his thoughts were not on his own faith. They were on that of his parents and his grandparents. God was to him the God of Abraham, his grandfather. So, although his journey was purposeful and had a clear destination, it was a journey from the known to the unknown, from the past to the future. The most difficult sort of course one can take, and one which is absolutely necessary. And then Yaakov had a dream. The location of the dream is indicated because it was at the end of a long day's walk from Beersheba to the north. The location that Yaakov chose for the night was not special in any way. It was decided upon simply because Yaakov was tired. And the night was too dark for him to carry on walking. In fact, you can probably imagine how dark a desert night can be over rough terrain. There was nothing soft or comfortable about this place. No one to comfort or reassure him at this time of great need and uncertainty. Or so he thought, as he laid down to sleep on his makeshift bed of sand and rocks. As far as we know, Yaakov at this time in his life did not even know how to seek God's help. But God didn't wait for him to do that. He interceded in Yaakov's life by giving him a vision and a hope. Yirmiyahu 29:11 comes to mind. For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you hope and a future. Yaakov was shown a ladder with its base on the earth reaching into the heavens. And he saw Melachim, angels, messengers of God, ascending, that is, from the earth where Yaakov was to the heavens, and then descending. So they actually came from where he was. What Yaakov didn't realize was that the angels he now saw had surrounded him, even while he was completely unaware of them. He saw the persona of God himself standing above the ladder, something which has never been described previously in the scriptures, although this kind of vision was given later to prophets like Yeshayahu. And in addition to what he saw, Yaakov actually heard the voice of God. God clearly identified himself to Yaakov as the one eternal God. And by his personal name or identity, Yod-He Vav-He, I am, as he would later describe himself to Moshe at the burning bush. And finally, he describes himself as the God of Yaakov's grandfather and father, the God who has a personal relationship and a covenant with Yaakov's family. And now God makes it clear to Yaakov that he has already planned to establish this covenant with Yaakov himself. He is the one chosen, not his brother, as in the same way as God has established the covenant with Yaakov's grandfather, Abraham, and with his father, Yitzchak, before him. This covenant relationship includes the promise of all the land of Canaan, which he is just about to leave. God promised that Yaakov's descendants would be multiplied into a great nation, And yet at this point, he has no wife, let alone children. And this nation will spread out to the west, to the east, to the north, and to the south. People from among the Goyim will be blessed with and through Yaakov and his descendants. And God promises something incredibly important. He will always be with Yaakov. No matter where he goes, he will always be with Yaakov. And he declares to Yaakov that he will return to the land of his birth. God pledged that he would perform everything he has promised. This is an oath that he's taking to perform everything he says. And here we read, I am with you and will keep you in all the places where you go and will bring you again into this land, for I will not leave you or forsake you. Often in the midst of our own journey, even if we have friends and family around us, we may feel just as alone as Yaakov. Ultimately, no matter how many people or possessions you have that you surround yourself with, you must still face solitude. And many people find that the most difficult thing. Because when everyone else leaves, you are alone. You're alone with yourself and with God. And you can run away from other people, but you can't run away from yourself, and you can never run away from God. That is the lesson that we learn from Yonah. The future, no matter how much you plan, is still unknown territory, providing no safe refuge, which of course is why some people try to live in the past. It's known. It may be terrible even, but they know it. This is the time when you need to meet with God as Yaakov met with him. Often God must bring us to the end of ourselves and our own resources, to the end of our own strength, in order to find us alone and open to him. Perhaps God will speak to you and give you a vision or a dream like Yaakov's, but he may choose a much less dramatic method to get your attention. Yaakov's dream may symbolize for us the way in which God has provided reconciliation for those who seek him. The latter demonstrates Mashiach's descent to us to provide the way to God. His ascent from us is for the purpose of interceding for all those who trust in him. Mashiach Yeshua provides the only access we have directly to the Eternal One. By faith, we perceive this through knowledge of the Holy Scriptures, and in prayer we approach. In answer to prayer, we receive what is needful. God promises that he will supply all of our needs, spiritual, physical, emotional, mental, financial. However desolate you may feel, remember that as with Yaakov, there are ministering angels, malachim, messengers of God, surrounding you even when you are least aware of them. Wherever your meeting with God takes place, that is your personal Beit El, in modern Hebrew, your Beit HaElohim. God welcomes you into his home to commune with him intimately. What was Yaakov's response? Immediately, he became aware of God's presence and his promises. Although he had no realization that God was with him before this time, now Yaakov has insight into the reality of God's presence. He responds to God with holy fear, awe, and reverence. Yaakov is overwhelmed by this visitation, and he knows that he must memorialize this event in a unique way. He now knows that God has been with him and will continue to be with him wherever his journey will take him. But the place of their meeting, that point at which Yaakov came to know God's presence and intentions towards him, will always remind him of the impact of that meeting and the changes that it has brought to his life. And so Yaakov offers an oblation of oil, and he sets up stones of remembrance, as is the custom to this day. He named the place Beit El, the house of Elohim, the place where God dwells, knowing now that God dwells with him wherever he might be. And then Yaakov made promises to God in response to God's promises and declarations to him. Although, of course, God asked nothing of Yaakov. As God had promised to meet all of Yaakov's needs and return him safely to his father's land, he now acknowledges Yod-He Vav-He as his God. No longer merely the God of his parents and his grandparents. From this time on, God will be known as the God of Yaakov, eventually the God of Israel, the name used for God more frequently in the scriptures than any other. Of all that God would give to him, Yaakov promised a tenth or a tithe of it to God. This was recognition of accepted practice, later codified in the Torah. Yaakov was changed by this experience, changed from one who knows about God to one who knows God, from one who does not put his trust in God to one who does. God met with Yaakov, and so he meets with us. Yaakov had a special calling upon his life, which began even before he was born, unbeknownst to him, but which became a relationship with God at the point of God's action in his life at Bethel. God sought out Yaakov, not the other way around. God made unconditional promises to Yaakov, which had nothing to do with anything that Yaakov could or would do for him. When we come into a personal relationship with God through the sacrificial atonement of Mashiach Yeshua, we begin a journey. Every moment takes us further away from the beginning of life and closer to its conclusion. It is God's desire that this journey will draw us closer to Him as participants in the covenant established with Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. God wants each new experience to draw us away from the past and toward the future that He has for us. We see the providence of God in the life of Yaakov, and we should be able, looking back, to see it in our own lives. God's time to visit us is often when we feel most forsaken, most alone. His assurance comes when we are ready to receive it. Melech David wrote in Tehillim 27, When my father and my mother forsake me, then Adonai will take me up. I would have fainted unless I had believed to see the goodness of Adonai. God provides consolation and comfort, something we all need, assuring us that we have both a skillful, omniscient guide and a watchful, omnipotent guard who goes before us and who follows behind us. He reminds us that the promises given to those who have gone before us are extended to us as well through his covenant. These promises are personalized, belonging as much to us as they did to Rav Shaul, who wrote, "May your roots go down deep into the soil of God's marvelous love, and may you be able to feel and understand and to experience this love for yourselves, though it is so great that you will never see the end of it or fully know or understand it. So at last you will be filled with God himself. Glory be to God, who by his mighty power at work within us is able to do far more than we would ever dare to ask or even dream of, infinitely beyond our highest prayers, desires, thoughts, or hopes." Hear these words of Melech David. "Therefore let everyone who is godly pray to you while you may be found. Surely when mighty waters rise, they will not reach him. You are my hiding place. You will protect me from trouble and surround me with songs of deliverance." The question is, do you, like Yaakov, put your trust in Hashem? Think about it. What do you trust him for? Today, tomorrow, the future, the life you want to lead, the life he wants you to lead. May God bless you this Shabbat and through the week ahead. Shabbat Shalom and Shavua Tov.